Silence covered the isthmus before the first explosions. For several hours, the line connecting Crimea to mainland Russia remained shrouded in uncertainty, communications faltered, convoys stopped, and the military command issued no explanation. By the time fragments of information began to emerge, it was already clear: the so-called land bridge, Moscow's vital artery through the occupied south, no longer existed. According to sources close to regional authorities, Ukrainian forces struck simultaneously across multiple crossings, effectively isolating the peninsula. But the scale of the disruption went beyond logistics. It symbolized the collapse of what Moscow once called its irreversible integration. By midday, traffic on the Kerch corridor had frozen. Civilian vehicles lined the roads heading north, engines idling, drivers waiting for instructions that never came. The Russian Ministry of Transport officially attributed the standstill to safety protocols, yet satellite images reviewed by independent observers showed columns of smoke and destroyed supply nodes. In expert circles, the incident is now being described as a strategic reversal, one that dismantles years of fortification and reopens a geographic vulnerability thought to be closed forever. However, behind these public assessments lies a quieter, more disquieting story: the fear of isolation spreading among the Russian population inside Crimea. In the cities of the peninsula, the atmosphere shifted within hours. Markets emptied, cash withdrawals surged, and local administrations imposed movement restrictions under the pretext of maintaining order. Yet reports circulating among logistics operators suggest that fuel reserves are already being rationed. According to insiders, regional command posts have received direct orders to prioritize evacuation routes for personnel and families of security officers. The official narrative insists that control is maintained, but every statement sounds less like reassurance and more like ritual. In the background, thousands began leaving in silence, heading toward the remaining ferry points and informal crossings. The exodus, though unacknowledged, is visible even from space. At this stage, analysts note that Ukraine's objective extends beyond military geography. The strikes, they say, were designed to dismantle the perception of permanence. For months, Moscow had projected the image of stability, rebuilt highways, new military bases, constant rhetoric about integration. Now, in a single day, that image has disintegrated. The peninsula that once symbolized expansion has turned into a trap. Officially, Russian defense spokesmen refer to temporary regroupings. Unofficially, the situation is described as untenable. And yet the information vacuum persists, maintained by silence and fragmentary updates. It is this silence that now defines the day. In these hours, discussions among diplomats and security experts point to a broader consequence: a psychological shift both inside Russia and across its borders. The bridge was not only a physical link but a symbol of continuity, a proof of control. With its loss, a question resurfaces: what happens when a state's symbolic geography begins to collapse faster than its military positions? Some suggest that this is the beginning of a strategic unraveling, others see it as a tactical pause. But by all accounts, the events unfolding today have erased a cornerstone of Moscow's post-2014 narrative. Perhaps it is worth paying close attention to what follows next. Several insiders believe this is only the first movement in a longer sequence. But beyond the smoke and silence, one fact remains: the land connection that once held Crimea to Russia has disappeared, and with it, the illusion of permanence that sustained the occupation. The rest of the story, as observers quietly remark, is still being written. By this point, the pattern of movement across southern Ukraine had changed entirely. Supply lines that for years appeared immutable were suddenly cut into fragments. Official Russian bulletins continued to use the term controlled redeployment, yet satellite tracking and open-source intelligence painted a different picture: convoys stranded without fuel, improvised bridges destroyed, and temporary pontoons sinking under their own weight. According to data reviewed by Western monitoring agencies, at least several key logistics corridors connecting the peninsula to mainland depots ceased functioning. But the more revealing element lay not in the visible damage, but in the rhythm of Moscow's reaction: slow, uncertain, and increasingly defensive. In analytical circles, this day is now being described as a turning point, not because of what was lost physically, but because of how the loss was absorbed politically. Throughout the day, state media maintained a cautious tone. Broadcasters replaced live coverage with archival footage, commentators avoided direct mention of Crimea, and only brief official notes appeared under neutral headlines. In the background, however, information leaks began circulating through military channels. According to insiders familiar with internal communications, emergency sessions were held to assess whether the peninsula could be supplied by air alone. The answer, reportedly, was negative. Aviation fuel reserves were insufficient, and most landing strips in the region were already operating under strain. Between the lines, it became evident that the logistical crisis was deeper than publicly admitted. In expert discussions, the term strategic encirclement began to reappear, a phrase absent from Russian discourse since the early phases of the war. Meanwhile, Ukrainian statements were unusually restrained. Officials merely noted that supply routes have been disrupted. Yet, according to multiple observers, this minimalism was deliberate. Kyiv appeared to be signaling not victory, but continuity. The operation was still unfolding. Intelligence analysts describe it as a layered offensive, where physical destruction serves only as the first act, followed by the psychological dismantling of the adversary's narrative. The land bridge, once presented as a permanent link of power, had turned into an emblem of vulnerability. Even in Russian military communities, frustration grew visible. Private communications intercepted during the day revealed confusion, lack of coordination, and a spreading sense that no one is in charge. But further than that, something else emerged: doubt. At the administrative level, officials in Crimea reportedly began preparing contingency measures. Banking systems slowed transactions, and communications with federal ministries were rerouted through alternate channels. According to several people with knowledge of the situation, an unannounced withdrawal plan was drafted to relocate essential personnel. Officially, these actions were called preventive measures. Unofficially, they were signs of retreat. In the same hours, ferry terminals once reserved for military use reopened to civilian transport, not as a gesture of aid, but as a means of dispersing pressure. Crowds were managed under the supervision of uniformed police, yet tension was visible even in the silence of the queues. Every hour, new groups arrived, seeking to leave a territory that suddenly felt disconnected from the world. In parallel, Moscow's political apparatus worked to reframe the situation. Statements from senior officials emphasized stability of governance, suggesting that what was happening in Crimea was temporary. But analysts note that the tone had changed. Phrases once used to project authority now carried an undertone of justification. In diplomatic channels, inquiries were sent to allied states requesting emergency shipments of construction materials and fuel components, an implicit admission that supply autonomy had failed. By this stage, the information front became as critical as the physical one. Every image, every phrase mattered. Yet the silence of the leadership only deepened speculation that the Kremlin had been caught unprepared. By the middle of the day, the psychological divide between official calm and internal anxiety became unmistakable. In expert circles, comparisons surfaced with earlier geopolitical ruptures, moments when control slipped not through defeat, but through erosion. "The bridge is gone" became less a report of destruction and more a metaphor circulating through military and diplomatic networks. Between the lines, it meant something larger: the loss of continuity, the fracture of a narrative that had defined an entire decade. Observers note that once such a symbol collapses, rebuilding it becomes not just a logistical task but a political impossibility. Still, among analysts there is caution: events of this magnitude rarely end in a single day. In these hours, the peninsula stands as both a fortress and a prison, surrounded not by enemies, but by consequences. However, behind the official caution lies another question that few in Moscow are ready to voice openly. What if this loss marks not the end of a campaign, but the beginning of something that can no longer be contained? At this stage, the situation revealed layers that had remained hidden beneath official narratives. What initially appeared as a sudden logistical disruption began to expose deeper structural weaknesses within the occupation apparatus. According to insiders, the strikes on the Kerch corridor were only the first stage of a carefully calculated Ukrainian strategy. Multiple points along the peninsula were simultaneously targeted, including secondary routes, depots, and fuel storage facilities. By midday, reports indicated that nearly every overland supply line connecting Crimea to Russia had been compromised. Yet the most striking revelation was not the physical damage itself, but the response, or, more accurately, the lack thereof, from the Central Command. Throughout the morning, local Russian military units scrambled to establish temporary bypasses and ad hoc supply lines. Engineers and logistics officers attempted to erect provisional bridges and reinforce minor roads, but every effort was met with setbacks: unstable ground, depleted materials, and continuing artillery pressure from Ukrainian positions. Sources in the region describe a sense of growing frustration among personnel. Operations that had once been routine now required improvisation at every level. The disconnect between field units and Moscow's strategic command became increasingly apparent. Orders were delayed, sometimes contradictory, and the chain of responsibility fractured. In expert assessments, these delays were interpreted not as mere bureaucratic inefficiency but as a symptom of systemic stress, a command structure unable to respond to simultaneous crises across multiple fronts. The civilian dimension further complicated the unfolding scenario. Local administrations, still under nominal Russian control, struggled to manage the exodus of residents. Roads leading northward became clogged with private vehicles, buses, and improvised convoys. Fuel shortages added to the chaos, forcing some evacuees to abandon vehicles mid-route. While official statements insisted that transportation and evacuation were under control, independent monitoring reported lines of cars extending tens of kilometers, some halted by destroyed infrastructure or checkpoints. Observers note that the scale of civilian movement, coupled with limited communication from authorities, created a psychological strain akin to a siege, not of the city itself, but of the population's confidence in governance. At the same time, intelligence channels suggested that Moscow was attempting to stabilize the situation through aerial logistics. Helicopters and cargo planes were dispatched to ferry critical supplies, yet operational capacity was constrained by weather, fuel availability, and the need to prioritize military over civilian needs. Insiders describe coordination meetings held in the capital where contingency plans were rapidly revised, sometimes hourly, as new reports from the peninsula arrived. The picture that emerges is one of controlled improvisation, the Russian state maintaining a veneer of authority while struggling to respond to a rapidly shifting environment. Analysts observe that such improvisation is rarely sustainable over an extended period, especially in a contested region where supply and morale are intertwined. Further analysis of the strategic implications underscores a shift in perception far beyond Crimea's immediate geography. The land bridge had been more than a transport route, it was a symbol of permanence, of integration, of Moscow's capacity to project power. Its destruction, therefore, reverberated across political and military networks. Ukrainian strategy, according to several intelligence reports, sought to exploit not only physical vulnerabilities but also the symbolic resonance of the infrastructure loss. By removing the perception of continuity, Kyiv effectively disrupted the narrative of control. In internal briefings, some Russian officials admitted that the impact on morale might exceed the logistical consequences, a quiet recognition that symbolism can be as destabilizing as bullets. Amid these developments, state messaging sought to maintain a facade of stability. Media outlets emphasized routine operations, downplayed the scope of the disruption, and circulated carefully edited visuals showing limited damage and ongoing engineering efforts. Yet the contrast between images and reports from on-the-ground observers was stark. In analytical circles, the discrepancy is interpreted as part of a broader strategy, controlling perception while buying time to regain operational footing. But insiders warn that such efforts often reveal cracks when information leaks, and in this instance, leaks were abundant. Photos and intercepted communications, albeit fragmentary, circulated quickly through informal channels, creating a narrative of isolation that official statements could not easily counter. By midday, the internal dissonance within Russian structures became even more apparent. Evacuation of families of personnel, the prioritization of military logistics over civilian needs, and hurried attempts to restore supply chains highlighted a conflict between immediate operational necessity and long-term strategic objectives. Sources note that these tensions were discussed in emergency sessions at regional command centers, where officers debated the allocation of scarce resources. Every decision carried consequences. A diverted convoy meant delayed reinforcements, a ration fuel shipment risked stalling evacuation efforts. The stakes, therefore, extended beyond Crimea itself, they rippled into the broader operational calculus of Moscow's southern command. In parallel, international monitoring noted subtle but meaningful shifts. Analysts outside Russia highlighted that the peninsula's isolation, now tangible rather than theoretical, altered the balance of power in the region. Supply dependency, morale, and political perception became intertwined, amplifying the crisis. Intelligence assessments described a psychological campaign unfolding in real time. The Ukrainian strategy exploited both tangible disruption and the intangible erosion of confidence within the occupying administration. In these hours, Crimea was no longer simply a territorial concern, it became a focal point of broader geopolitical signals. Allies and adversaries alike were parsing every report, every image, every communiqué for hints of systemic vulnerability. And yet, even as these assessments circulated, an important subtlety emerged. The public messaging from Moscow, while calibrated, contained an undercurrent of admission, the language of necessity, of extraordinary measures, of temporary adjustments. In internal briefings, officials reportedly acknowledged the unprecedented nature of the day. This acknowledgement, while carefully shielded from public scrutiny, is precisely the kind of insight that shapes expert understanding. It signals a recognition that conventional methods of control have failed, even if the word failure is never uttered. In strategic terms, the land bridge is gone, but the implications extend beyond the visible destruction. They expose fault lines in command, perception, and the psychological cohesion of the occupation apparatus. For analysts observing from the outside, the day presents a layered picture: simultaneous physical destruction, logistical improvisation, civilian exodus, symbolic collapse, and political recalibration. Every component interacts with the others, producing a compound effect far greater than the sum of its parts. The perception of stability has fractured, yet the narrative of control persists in public statements. Between these contrasting realities lies the true story of the day, a story only partially visible, yet unmistakably present for those following every fragment of information. At this juncture, it is clear that the conflict is no longer solely about territory. It is about narrative, infrastructure, and perception. Possibly, it is worth following closely what happens next. Several sources indicate that today's events may represent only the first visible layer of a complex and ongoing strategic operation. The unfolding of these hours provides a rare view of how physical geography, military planning, and psychological operations intersect. And while official statements insist on stability, the internal calculus tells another story, one that has begun to redefine the operational reality on the peninsula. By mid-afternoon, the situation escalated into a level of complexity that few observers had anticipated. What began as a disruption of supply lines had, in a matter of hours, transformed into a multidimensional crisis affecting logistics, governance, and perception simultaneously. Analysts note that the apparent synchronization of Ukrainian strikes points to a meticulously planned operation, executed with precision to maximize both material disruption and psychological effect. Multiple secondary routes, previously considered low risk, were now blocked or rendered unstable, and key depots on the peninsula reported partial destruction or contamination. Yet the real pressure was not merely physical, it was systemic. Sources familiar with command operations describe the day as a test of the entire regional infrastructure, revealing vulnerabilities that had remained hidden behind layers of bureaucratic oversight. The scale of the evacuation added another layer to the crisis. Thousands of residents and personnel associated with military and security institutions attempted to leave simultaneously, overwhelming the limited transportation network. Lines of vehicles stretched for dozens of kilometers, fuel shortages compounded delays, and the tension among civilians grew palpable even in the absence of open confrontation. According to insiders, local administrations had no contingency for this magnitude of movement. Emergency plans were enacted, but resources were scarce, and prioritization decisions, whose evacuation took precedence, which supply lines were maintained, became immediate operational dilemmas. Analysts describe this dynamic as a microcosm of a larger strategic failure, a state capable of controlling narratives, yet struggling to manage essential flows of people and resources. Meanwhile, the psychological and symbolic dimensions intensified. The land bridge had long been portrayed by Moscow as an immutable link, a demonstration of permanence and control. Its sudden disappearance, coupled with the visible exodus, challenged that narrative at every level. Across Crimea, public spaces once used for official ceremonies and displays of power were now sites of tension, with makeshift checkpoints and lines of abandoned vehicles dominating the landscape. Internal communications, intercepted by analysts, revealed frustration among command personnel. "We are running out of options," one message reportedly read. "Supplies cannot reach forward units, civilians are blocking critical routes, orders are inconsistent." The admission, while discreet, exposed the thin veneer of authority that had been projected to the outside world. At the same time, the political apparatus in Moscow attempted to contain the fallout. Statements emphasized continuity, control, and ongoing engineering efforts to restore infrastructure. Yet even these messages contained subtle admissions of the extraordinary nature of the day. Officials referred to temporary adjustments, redeployments, and mitigation measures, language that, while neutral on the surface, in expert assessments signals recognition of an operational collapse. In internal briefings, aides reportedly stressed the need to manage perception more carefully than logistics, an acknowledgement that the battle over narrative had become as important as the battle on the ground. Analysts note that such dual pressures, the physical and the perceptual, create compound stress on command structures, often producing decisions that prioritize optics over efficacy. The flow of information itself became a battlefield. While official media sought to minimize the visibility of destruction, open-source intelligence and satellite imagery quickly filled the gaps. Leaked communications and images from local networks painted a far more detailed picture: destroyed bridges, immobilized convoys, fuel shortages, and crowded evacuation points. Observers outside the region noted a striking contrast between official calm and on-the-ground disruption. Analysts interpret this as a deliberate informational strategy: delay and filter knowledge to retain a semblance of control. Yet even as the day progressed, the volume of unfiltered data made complete containment impossible. In expert circles, this combination of disruption, improvisation, and partial transparency is recognized as a tipping point, a moment when operational resilience is tested not by enemy action alone, but by the interaction of logistical, symbolic, and informational factors. In parallel, the regional military command faced internal tensions. Decisions about resource allocation, which routes to prioritize, which depots to repair, which convoys to send forward, required constant reassessment. Emergency meetings, reportedly conducted in shifts, aimed to synchronize efforts between engineering units, logistics coordinators, and civilian administrators. Every adjustment had immediate consequences. Diverting fuel to one sector meant leaving another exposed. Prioritizing evacuation for families of security personnel slowed movement for civilians with essential roles. Sources indicate that these internal deliberations revealed a growing recognition: the occupation's infrastructure, once deemed secure, could no longer sustain simultaneous crises. The day became a test not just of material resilience, but of strategic flexibility and command coherence. External monitoring highlighted the broader implications. Analysts in neighboring regions observed that Crimea's effective isolation altered the operational calculus for both sides. Ukrainian strategy, they concluded, was not limited to physical destruction; it was a carefully calibrated effort to exploit both vulnerability and perception. By targeting infrastructure and supply continuity, Kyiv forced Moscow into a reactive posture, shaping the narrative before a counteroffensive could be implemented. Experts note that the symbolic impact, the sudden vulnerability of what had been considered a permanent link, may have lasting consequences on morale and governance, extending well beyond the immediate geography of the peninsula. By this stage of the day, the interplay of logistical paralysis, population movement, symbolic collapse, and information management created a scenario of unprecedented complexity. Analysts describe the unfolding events as a convergence of multiple crises: the physical, the psychological, and the strategic. Each element amplified the others, producing a compound effect more destabilizing than any single factor in isolation. Even as official statements sought to project calm, internal reports suggested a heightened sense of urgency. The balance between maintaining authority and managing reality had tilted, and the strain on command and control structures became increasingly visible. Yet, amid this escalating tension, there remained a calculated restraint. Official channels avoided dramatic language, carefully framing actions as routine adjustments, temporary measures, and operational redeployments. Analysts interpret this as an attempt to control perception, to slow the psychological impact while reasserting authority. However, the contrast between narrative and reality was too great to conceal entirely. In the corridors of power, discussions reportedly shifted toward more radical contingency plans, establishing alternative supply chains, accelerating evacuation priorities, and preparing for sustained isolation. What appeared on the surface as calm governance masked a more urgent and complex calculus, one that combined survival, logistics, and the management of perception into a single, high-stakes decision-making environment. At this point, observers cautiously note that the dynamics of the day are unlikely to stabilize without significant intervention. Analysts emphasize that the current phase is not an isolated event but part of an evolving sequence, where each decision carries cascading consequences. As the afternoon progressed, the weight of multiple converging pressures, logistical failure, civilian exodus, symbolic loss, and informational conflict, transformed Crimea into both a battlefield and a lens through which the broader contest for control, influence, and narrative clarity can be examined. In the unfolding hours, the peninsula remained a test case for the resilience of Moscow's administrative, military, and strategic capacities, and the outcomes would reverberate far beyond the immediate geography. However, behind the apparent calm of official messaging, it became increasingly evident that the operational, symbolic, and psychological stakes had reached a new threshold, a complex and tense reality that would not easily recede. The events of the day, sources warn, are not isolated; they form a prelude to further movements and recalibrations. And in this complex interplay of strategy and perception, one truth stands out clearly: the bridge is gone, and with it, the illusion of unshakable control. But beyond that, the next steps remain unseen, unfolding in a careful and deliberate calculus that few outside the inner circles can fully discern. As the day progressed into its final hours, the contours of the crisis in Crimea began to crystallize into a complex tableau of control, vulnerability, and perception. By this stage, the immediate shock of the land bridge's destruction had shifted into a deeper, more insidious tension, one that intertwined the physical isolation of the peninsula, the psychological state of its residents and personnel, and the broader strategic calculations of Moscow. Analysts emphasize that what appeared outwardly as a momentary disruption was, in fact, a systemic stress test. The infrastructure, administrative cohesion, and military command of the occupation apparatus all strained under pressures they had never faced simultaneously. Observers now describe the day as a turning point, not marked by a singular event, but by the cascading consequences of compounded vulnerabilities. Civilian movement continued to dominate the landscape. Evacuation points were overwhelmed, temporary shelters filled quickly, and private convoys pushed forward on every available route. Reports indicate that in some districts, residents waited for hours in silence, engines idling, while local authorities struggled to provide direction. Fuel scarcity and damaged roads further complicated departure, forcing spontaneous improvisation among those trying to escape. According to insiders, priority was given to personnel associated with security services and essential administration, a decision that left many civilians navigating a tenuous network of partially accessible roads. The exodus, though invisible in official statements, created an unmistakable pattern. Crimea, once connected and controlled, was now effectively severed. In the corridors of Moscow, the implications were being assessed with unprecedented urgency. Analysts and senior advisors convened multiple sessions, evaluating not just immediate tactical responses, but the broader strategic ramifications of today's events. Alternative supply channels were considered, from airdrops to naval resupply, each constrained by limited capacity and the continuing threat of Ukrainian interdiction. According to sources with access to these meetings, the consensus was sobering. The occupation's infrastructure, previously assumed resilient, had revealed critical fragilities. Decisions that would normally follow established protocol were now made under conditions of uncertainty, with each adjustment carrying cascading consequences for both military and civilian populations. The psychological dimension was equally pronounced. In expert assessments, the destruction of the land bridge has a symbolic resonance that may outweigh the purely logistical effects. The bridge had functioned as more than a transport link, it represented the permanence of Moscow's presence and the continuity of control. Its loss, therefore, signaled vulnerability, and even in the absence of overt confrontation, the perception of fragility rapidly propagated through both the local population and administrative structures. Analysts note that this perception has tangible effects on decision-making. Every communication, every deployment, and every policy shift must now account for the heightened uncertainty and the erosion of confidence within the occupying forces. The symbolic collapse of permanence has become a critical factor in real-time operational calculus. Information, meanwhile, continued to shape the unfolding narrative. Official channels maintained a tone of calm, emphasizing routine measures, repair efforts, and the resilience of administrative structures. However, independent observations, satellite imagery, and intercepted communications painted a far more nuanced picture: compromised supply routes, congested evacuation corridors, rationed resources, and mounting internal coordination challenges. Experts note that the contrast between official messaging and the reality on the ground reinforces the perception of vulnerability, even as Moscow attempts to project control. This duality, the tension between narrative and material reality, has emerged as one of the most consequential elements of the day, influencing both internal deliberations and external interpretations. Within Crimea itself, the interplay of civilian and military priorities intensified. Command structures had to allocate scarce resources carefully. Fuel, transport, and personnel were rerouted continuously in response to emerging disruptions. Evacuation plans were revised on the fly, with families of security and administrative personnel prioritized over other groups, while improvised logistics teams sought to maintain essential supply flows. Sources note that these measures, though necessary, contributed to a perception of crisis management rather than strategic stability. Each decision, each diversion, each rerouted convoy became part of a broader calculus of survival, where operational efficacy and the management of perception were inseparable. Analysts observing from outside the region emphasize the broader implications. The collapse of a symbolically and strategically critical connection has ripple effects beyond Crimea's borders. Neighboring regions, allied observers, and adversarial intelligence services now perceive both opportunity and vulnerability. Ukraine's approach, deliberately restrained in public statements, underscores a sophisticated understanding of the interplay between physical disruption and psychological pressure. By dismantling the perception of permanence, Kyiv has forced Moscow into a reactive posture, compelling adjustments not only in logistics, but in communications, political framing, and internal prioritization. The land bridge's destruction thus functions as a strategic lever, one that influences behavior far beyond its immediate geography. By the closing hours of the day, a sense of suspended tension prevailed. Analysts describe an environment where each movement, each statement, each logistical adjustment carries amplified weight. The interplay of material reality, psychological perception, and narrative control has created a multidimensional crisis that resists simple resolution. Observers emphasize that while official channels maintain a calm, controlled posture, the underlying pressures continue to mount, forcing adaptations in real time. The day's events, in this sense, represent not a conclusion, but a pivot, a moment when prior assumptions are tested and new realities must be integrated into strategic planning. Possibly, it is worth remaining attentive to the unfolding dynamics. Sources indicate that the operational and perceptual consequences of this day may continue to reverberate long after the immediate disruption has passed. Analysts note that the erosion of a symbolically vital link, coupled with tangible logistical failures and the strain on population and command structures, constitutes a shift in the equilibrium of control. In these hours, Crimea exists as both a test and a mirror, a reflection of how power is exercised, contested, and perceived under conditions of simultaneous disruption. For observers, the lesson is clear: control is not a static attribute, and permanence can unravel in hours. At first glance, the day may appear to have ended with measured statements and visible repair efforts. But those attuned to the deeper signals recognize that the land bridge's destruction is only the surface layer. Beneath it lies a shifting interplay of vulnerability, perception, and strategy, a complex landscape that will shape decisions, movements, and narratives far beyond the peninsula. The silence that envelopes official channels, the subtle adjustments of command, the cautious recalibrations in policy, all indicate that the story is far from over. At this moment, Crimea stands as both a testament to disruption and a harbinger of continuing strategic recalibration. And those who watch closely understand, the day has closed, but the deeper consequences of what has unfolded are only beginning to emerge.